He was a Marine reduced to begging on alien streets, but when Cade asked, "Can I play for food?" the laughter stopped cold. What happened when his fingers touched that xenophone changed 3-star systems forever. This isn't just another sci-fi story. It's about how raw human emotion became the most powerful weapon in a galaxy that tried to erase us. Cade moved through the rain-slicked alleys of Cerulean Port, his boots navigating the uneven plating where alien waste pooled in neon reflections. The artificial weather system maintained a constant drumming hum across the domed city, a sound that never varied no matter what hour the station kept. His uniform, once the mark of a decorated Marine, now hung off his frame in tatters. The scars on his hands and face told stories of campaigns fought. But here in the port's lower levels, they meant nothing more than another set of markings on a human animal. A Vexillian guard turned its segmented head toward him, mandibles clicking in disapproval. Its thorax armor gleamed under the flickering advertisement hollows. "Move along, human. No lingering near the commerce lanes." The translator unit pinned to its carapace delivered the words in a flat, metallic tone. Cade kept walking, his eyes fixed on the ground ahead. He'd learned early that meeting their gaze only invited more attention, more disgust. The guard watched him until he turned the corner, its many-faceted eyes tracking him like twin clusters of black glass. Further down the main thoroughfare, the Moon Quartz venue glowed with restrained opulence. Its entrance was a cascade of liquid light, and the patrons filtering inside wore silks that shimmered with microcircuit patterns. Cade approached the entrance, his stomach clenched with a hunger that had become his constant companion. The bouncer, a broad-shouldered Krellian with skin like polished granite, extended an arm before Cade could step onto the welcome mat. "Species-restricted event," it rumbled. No explanation, no apology, just the unyielding reality of Cerulean Port's social order. Cade retreated, his shoulders tightening with every dismissive glance from passing aliens. A group of Illuminati diplomats swept past, their slender forms draped in iridescent robes, not one of them bothering to look in his direction. To them, he was part of the scenery, a flawed, organic component in their perfect machine of a station. The scent of spiced meat from a vendor's cart made his mouth water, but he had no credits, no trade goods, nothing to offer except the one thing he hadn't tried yet. He thought of the xenophone he'd seen through the Moon Quartz's viewing portal, its crystalline strings waiting for a touch. He'd only held one once during a brief cultural exchange years ago. His fingers remembered the odd, resonant hum of the strings, the way they answered not to skill but to feeling. It was a foolish idea. Begging for food with music, what alien would even allow it? But his choices had narrowed to this: risk humiliation or keep starving. So he turned back toward the entertainment district, his mind already rehearsing the words. "Can I play for food?" It sounded as desperate as he felt. But sometimes desperation is the only draft worth drinking from. Cade found Theron Lux backstage, the celebrated Illuminati musician surrounded by a low hum of admirers and tuning technicians. The xenophonist's slender fingers were still hovering over the strings of his instrument, as if reluctant to break contact even for a moment. Up close, Cade could see the fine silver filigree tracing Theron's temple, a mark of his status. The air smelled of polished crystal and ozone. Cade's own scent, sweat and damp cloth, stood out like a stain. He cleared his throat. The words came out rough, unpolished. "Can I play for food?" For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then Theron Lux turned, his large eyes reflecting the stage lights like dark pools. A soft, condescending laugh escaped him, a sound like wind chimes. The technicians nearby echoed it, their amusement sharp and dismissive. They saw a human vagrant, another stain on the polished floors of Cerulean Port's cultural heart. Another soul broken by the station's ruthlessness, but Theron's laughter died as his gaze lingered. He noticed the way Cade held himself, shoulders squared, spine straight, a vestige of military discipline beneath the grime. He saw the calluses on the human's hands, scars that spoke of violence, not music. There was a stillness to him that didn't match the desperation in his voice. Theron tilted his head, curiosity flickering behind his composed expression. He gestured toward the xenophone resting on its stand. It was a complex instrument, all crystalline strings and resonance chambers, designed for multi-jointed fingers and fine motor control. Not human hands. Cade approached it like a soldier approaching unfamiliar artillery. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, mocking, curious. A few patrons from the main hall drifted closer, drawn by the spectacle. Their stares were like physical pressure. Cade ignored them. He placed his hands on the xenophone. His fingers were too thick, his touch unrefined. This wasn't about technique. It was about the tremor in his wrists, the tightness in his throat, the memory of rations running low and comrades lost in silent space. He pressed down. The note that emerged was raw, imperfect. It wavered in the air, thin at first, then growing. It wasn't clean or precise like Theron's music. It was ragged, full of fractures. It carried the weight of hunger, the bitterness of rejection, the loneliness of a species pushed to the margins. It was a note that shouldn't have been possible on an instrument designed for technical perfection, but it was. And it hung there, trembling, alive with everything Cade had buried for years. He wasn't playing for food anymore. He was playing because he had to. Because every dismissal, every cold look, every night spent hungry on a metal floor had led here. To this instrument, to this moment. To proving that humanity wasn't just survival, it was feeling, deep and unchecked and impossible to ignore. The note held. And in the silence that followed, something in the room shifted. The xenophone wasn't built for human hands. Its crystalline strings were calibrated for the precise pressure points of Illuminari fingertips, the resonance chambers tuned to their bioacoustic sensitivity. Cade's touch defied every design parameter. Where a professional musician would have produced a clean, measured tone, his was a ragged vibration, a sound that should have fractured and died, but it didn't. It held. He lifted his fingers, but the note refused to fade. It hung in the air, a tangible presence that seemed to vibrate through the floor plating and the very walls of the room. It wasn't loud. It was persistent, a hum that settled into the bones of everyone present. The laughter and murmured jokes from the alien patrons ceased mid-breath. A Krellian merchant, previously leaning against a pillar with arms crossed, now stood rigid, his stony face tilted as if hearing a distant alarm. A group of Vexillians nearby froze, their antennae twitching in synchronized, agitated patterns. The sound did something the instrument's creators never intended. It bypassed the strict formal appreciation of technical skill and went straight to the psychic receptors most species used for basic empathic connection. It wasn't a melody to be analyzed. It was a feeling to be absorbed. For the Illuminari, whose emotions were often muted and cerebral, it was a shock, a wave of pure, undiluted longing that resonated in their nervous systems like a struck bell. For the more pragmatic Krellians, it echoed a deep, seldom acknowledged yearning for something beyond commerce and conquest. Tears, a human response, began to form in optical organs not designed for them. A Vexillian guard blinked slowly, a clear fluid welling at the corner of its multi-lensed eyes. A dignitary from a species that communicated through chromatophore patterns found its skin flushing with a soft, uncontrolled hue of azure regret. The note was a key fitting a lock nobody knew existed, unlocking a chamber of universal loneliness they all shared but never named. Theron Lux remained utterly still. His professional critic's mind, which had been preparing to dissect the performance for its countless flaws, went silent. The technical imperfections, the uneven pressure, the slight waver were no longer faults. They were the source of the power. This wasn't music played from a place of training. It was pulled from a place of survival. The condescension in his large eyes evaporated, replaced by a dawning, profound awe. He watched Cade not as a beggar, but as a source. The carefully constructed hierarchy of the room, where artistic mastery was the highest currency, dissolved in the space of that one sustained, imperfect note. Mockery turned to reverence without a single word being spoken. The air itself felt different, charged and still, as if the galaxy had just inhaled and was waiting to see what happened next. In the front row of the crowd, a young Illuminari student held up their comm unit. The device was meant for scholarly notes, not recording history. The light was bad, the angle awkward, shaking slightly as the student tried to hold it steady. But it captured the moment Cade's fingers touched the xenophone. It recorded the raw, imperfect note that refused to fade. The video was grainy, lit mostly by the stage's ambient glow. Cade's face was half in shadow, his posture a mix of desperation and defiance. The audio, however, was clear. It picked up the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere, the silence that fell, the collective intake of breath. The student, on a whim, uploaded it to a public network node before leaving the venue. They tagged it with a single word: truth. That shaky, low-light vid did not travel through normal channels. It bypassed the curated art feeds and sanctioned entertainment streams. It spread through back-channel networks, shared user-to-user, species-to-species. It appeared on Illuminati scholarly forums, Krellian merchant guild boards, even Vexillian security force intranets. Normally, cross-species content faced algorithmic suppression or cultural filters. This clip ignored them. It was shared with an urgency that defied logic. Within hours, it was trending on 3 separate systems' primary social hubs. View counts multiplied not by the thousands, but by the millions. Comment threads exploded in a dozen languages, all asking the same question: who is he? Theron Lux woke to a deluge of messages. His professional profile, once a curated space for critical acclaim and performance announcements, was flooded with notifications. Overnight, his reputation transformed. He was no longer just Theron Lux, celebrated xenophonist. He was Theron Lux, the one who discovered that human. Colleagues who had once praised his technical mastery now asked about the emotion behind the music. Interview requests came from media outlets that had never covered the arts before. His quiet backstage moment of allowing a beggar to play was being reframed as an act of visionary courage. He found himself the reluctant ambassador for a sound he didn't create, but merely allowed to exist. In silver-skinned compounds on Argentia, aristocrats who wouldn't be caught dead in Cerulean Port's lower levels paused their debates to watch the clip on polished data slates. They discussed the technique or lack thereof, but more than that, they discussed the feeling. On a refueling outpost near the rim, a group of off-duty human Marines crowded around a terminal. One of them froze, her drink halfway to her lips. She recognized the set of the shoulders, the faint scar above the eyebrow visible in the dim light. "Gods below," she whispered. "That's Cade. I thought he was dead on Phobos." The video became a silent rallying point, a piece of shared proof that humanity's value wasn't gone, just overlooked. It was no longer just a performance. It was a symbol. This unexpected fame was a gravity well, pulling attention from every corner. Theron's comm unit received a message encrypted with a priority Argentian diplomatic seal. Another arrived flagged with the insignia of a major trading consortium. Cade's desperate plea for a meal had unlocked a door. It proved that something fundamental was missing from their polished, perfected galaxy. That hunger, that raw need, resonated deeper than any composed symphony ever could. It was the catalyst. The conversation was no longer about one human or one song. It was about what his music revealed about all of them. The cultural shift had begun, and it started with a shaky video and a single lingering note. Linza Argentis watched the viral recording from the polished silence of her family's music chamber. The walls were lined with rare acoustic woods and Argentian silver inlay, a stark contrast to Cerulean Port's grimy backstage. Her emerald eyes, a genetic trait of her high-blood lineage, didn't widen in wonder. They narrowed. Where others saw a raw emotional outburst, she saw structure struggling to break through. She was a student of xenomusicology, trained to dissect sonic patterns across species. Her tutors had taught her that music was mathematics given sound, emotion quantified into harmonic law. This human's performance defied that. It was messy, unrefined, and yet, she replayed the moment his fingers made contact. There, in the micro-tremor of the third string's resonance, was a controlled waver. It wasn't random. It was a deliberate hesitation, a choice made in the space between nerve impulse and action. He was fighting the instrument's design, forcing it to obey a different logic. A slow, critical thought formed in her mind, crystallizing into the core principle she'd been wrestling with for years. Emotion without technique is chaos. Technique without emotion is empty. This human was chaos reaching for structure. He was the embodiment of the philosophical problem she'd been trying to solve. He wasn't just a vagrant. He was a potential proof of concept. Her first instinct, bred into her by centuries of aristocratic tradition, was to dismiss it. A human novelty, a fleeting disruption to the galactic cultural order. Her family would expect her to ignore it, to focus on her arranged betrothal and the political alliances it secured, but her eyes remained locked on the screen. She couldn't look away. This was more than a performance. It was a key. It suggested that the highest art wasn't purity of form or purity of bloodline, but the fusion of disparate elements. It proposed that something new, something greater, could be built across the very barriers her society held sacred. She opened a secure comm line, her fingers hovering over the interface. To contact Theron Lux directly was a breach of protocol. An Argentian heir did not correspond with a mere performing artist, especially not over a matter involving a human. But protocol had never answered the questions that kept her awake at night. She composed a brief, formal message. Not praise, an analysis. She pointed out the specific microtonal shift in the second bar, the unintended harmonic it created with the room's resonance frequency. She framed it as an academic inquiry, but the subtext was an invitation. She was no longer just an observer of the phenomenon. She was engaging with it. Her message pinged into Theron's overloaded inbox, a single note of impeccable, curious intellect amid the noise of acclaim and shock. She didn't know it yet, but she had just thrown the first stone. The student, confined by silver walls and genetic expectation, had seen a crack in the universe's design, and she decided to widen it. Linza brought Cade into the Argentian compound through a side entrance, a subtle but meaningful breach of protocol. The air changed the moment they crossed the threshold. The humid, recycled atmosphere of cerulean port vanished, replaced by air so pure and cool it felt thin. Light came from everywhere and nowhere, reflecting off walls of polished argentium alloy. The surfaces gleamed with a soft internal luminescence, each one perfectly smooth without seam or scratch. It was a world built on the principle of flawless continuity. Cade's boots, still dusted with the grime of the lower port levels, seemed to leave temporary stains on the immaculate flooring that slowly faded as the nano-cleaners did their work. They moved through a grand hall where portraits of ancestors gazed down from silver frames. Their features were uniformly elegant, their skin the characteristic metallic sheen, their eyes all sharing Linza's piercing emerald hue. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant melodic chime of a timekeeper. It was the opposite of the chaotic, vibrant noise of the streets. This was order. This was purity. It was a physical manifestation of a bloodline meticulously curated over centuries. Matriarch Celine Argentis observed their approach from a raised seating area. She did not move. Her hands rested on the arms of her chair, her posture a study in controlled assessment. Her gaze was not hostile, but analytical, as if Cade were a problematic data stream she was tasked with interpreting. She noted the way he moved, the Marine's awareness still evident beneath his borrowed ill-fitting tunic. She saw the human inconsistency he introduced into her perfect environment. It was a variable, a disruption. Her son, standing to her left, provided the counterpoint to her silence. The betrothal documents are prepared for review, the elder one stated, his voice a low, resonant tone designed to carry authority. Prefect Jorak expects our commitment before the Vidian Compact is finalized. His fleet security contracts are vital. The unspoken words hung heavier than the spoken ones. Linza's union was not a matter of love or choice. It was a strategic pivot in a high-stakes negotiation, a move to secure their family's influence for another generation. The compact would bind 3 major systems in a new trade and defense alliance. Family loyalties were the bedrock of such agreements. Cade stood there, absorbing it all. He understood battlefields in terms of engagement. This was a different kind of war. His music, his very presence, was a direct challenge to their core identity. He represented genetic dilution, cultural contamination, the unpredictable chaos of a species that valued raw feeling over centuries of tradition. They weren't against him personally. They were against everything he symbolized. The conflict was embedded in the gleaming walls and the unmoving faces of the ancestors. Individual desire was a spark next to the glacier of their inherited duty. He saw the trap then, not of walls and bars, but of obligation and history. His hope of a simple connection with Linza seemed ludicrously small against the massive gleaming weight of Argentian legacy. This was the true enemy, and it couldn't be fought with a weapon. His marine training took over, but in a new way. This wasn't about clearing a room or advancing on a position. It was about reading a different kind of terrain. He noted pressure gradients in the pipes, identified the sounds of different pumps and filters, used the vibration in the metal to sense movement in adjacent conduits. He was no longer a victim waiting for rescue. He was a strategist navigating an hostile environment, his survival depending on wit and observation, not firepower. The Undersighty operated on a different set of rules. where the Argentian name held no power and ingenuity was the only currency that mattered. He emerged into a wider chamber, a junction where several large pipes met. The air was hazy with vapor, and the light came from flickering emergency strips. Theron was there, waiting beside a rusted outflow valve, his illuminari form looking out of place amidst the grime. He held a small scanner, its light sweeping the area. "I pay a great deal for the maintenance schematics of this station," he said by way of greeting, his voice calm despite their surroundings. It seemed a prudent investment. Their reunion wasn't emotional. It was tactical. They stood in the bowels of the station, and the reality of their situation solidified. Theron's connections, his credits, had found a limit, but the Gellenguard's actions hinted at something else. They realized their support wasn't confined to artists and intellectuals in comfortable studios. It extended into the port's underbelly, to the maintenance workers, the sanitation crews, the countless beings who kept the lights on for the elite living above. These were people who understood oppression not as a political concept, but as a daily reality. The hum of a melody had traveled down to these depths too, finding resonance with those who knew what it was to be overlooked. This network, this unseen workforce, became their new advantage. It was a map of loyalties that Nevin's credits couldn't buy, and his mercenaries couldn't intimidate. They had wealth and influence. Cade and Theron now had the people who knew how the city really worked. Back in the secure silence of Theron's studio, the air changed. It was no longer a rehearsal space. It was a workshop for building a new reality. The walls, lined with acoustic buffers, absorbed their every note, protecting their secret. With their reunion came a new intensity. There was no time for hesitation. Linza pulled a data slate from a hidden compartment in her gown. On it was her personal project, a composition she'd been crafting in stolen moments for years. It wasn't an Argentian piece. It was an attempt to build a bridge. The musical notation was a complex lattice of mathematical precision, pure Argentian structure. But woven through it were unfamiliar scales, progressions designed to resonate with species that valued feeling over form. It was a sonic blueprint for something that didn't exist yet. Cade listened as she played the framework on a practice module. The sound was technically flawless, but it felt sterile, like a perfectly engineered machine with no soul. He understood his role immediately. He wasn't there to match her technique. He was there to give it breath. He placed his hands on a xenophone, his touch still rough, unrefined. Where her notes were clean, his were textured. He thought of the cold cell floor, the sting of rejection, the warmth of Linza's hand in his. He poured it all into the strings. The raw human emotion didn't clash with her perfect harmony. It grounded it. It gave the mathematical structure a heartbeat. The two sounds began to weave together, creating a third thing entirely, a music that was more than the sum of its parts. Their collaboration shifted then. It deepened beyond the quiet tension of romance into something more significant. They were engineers constructing a cultural bridge, stone by stone, note by note. Every harmonic they discovered felt like a political act, a direct challenge to the ideology of separation. The music itself became their weapon, a tool to dismantle centuries of prejudice built on the myth of genetic and artistic purity. They were preparing to demonstrate a simple, dangerous truth to the entire galaxy. Adaptation is stronger than stagnation. Theron watched from the control booth, his usual critical demeanor replaced by a grim focus. He saw the stakes clearly. This was no longer an artistic endeavor. It was a tactical operation. While Cade and Linza fused their sonic languages, Theron worked his own kind of magic. Using his network of contacts and a significant portion of his credits, he engineered a distraction. He created a phantom lead for Nevin's mercenaries, sending them on a frantic chase to a docking bay on the port's opposite side, chasing a rumor of a hidden human stowaway. The ruse bought them precious uninterrupted hours. This window of safety allowed for their most risky move. Linza, disguised in a plain text coverall, guided Cade back into the heart of the Argentian diplomatic quarter for final preparations. They moved through service corridors, their hearts pounding, not with fear of capture, but with the immense weight of what they were about to do. Their duet was no longer just a performance. It was a statement, a declaration of cross-species possibility. They were going to stand before the most powerful beings in 3 systems and prove that the old rules were obsolete. In that studio, with Theron guarding the door and their music filling the air, They prepared to start a revolution with nothing but sound. They stood in the center of Linza's private chamber, a space stripped of the usual formal grandeur. The xenophones were not on a stage, but resting on simple stands, surrounded by the quiet intimacy of her personal quarters. Their audience consisted of one person, matriarch Celine Argentis, seated in a single chair, her expression unreadable. There were no diplomats to impress, no family members to posture for. The only light came from the soft glow of the Argentium walls. This was not for show. It was for proof. Kate and Linza began to play. The sound that filled the room was not a performance crafted for an audience of thousands. It was a conversation. Their instruments spoke to each other. Linza's notes were structured, precise, a lattice of perfect Argentian harmony. Cade's answered with raw human emotion, a tremor of feeling that gave her mathematical perfection a heartbeat. The music crossed the boundary between their species, between his rough existence and her polished upbringing, between a forgotten marine and an aristocratic heir. It became a single unified language spoken in the quiet of the room. There was no hiding behind ceremony here. The truth of what they were creating was laid bare. Celine watched, her hands resting in her lap. The stern authority that usually defined her posture began to soften at the edges. Her gaze, once analytical and distant, focused on their hands, on the way his calloused fingers found the spaces between her flawless technique. She saw the fusion happen in real time, not as a concept in a diplomatic brief, but as a sound in the air. It was not data. It was not a political argument. It was evidence of something new, something that should not have been possible under the old rules. Her spine lost some of its rigid alignment. A slow, thoughtful breath escaped her. She did not applaud when they finished. The silence that followed was heavier than any praise. She looked from Cade to Linza, her emerald eyes holding a new kind of calculation. "The galaxy is changing," she said, her voice quiet but clear in the still room. "Species that can't adapt will be left behind." The words were not a concession. They were a strategic realignment. She saw the cultural shift happening across the systems, the viral spread of Cade's music, the undeniable curiosity it had sparked. Opposing it was no longer protecting tradition. It was risking obsolescence. Her support, once their greatest obstacle, transformed into their most powerful advantage. She recognized that this partnership, this fusion of human emotion and Argentian structure, could redefine their house's position. Instead of being guardians of a fading past, they could become leaders of a new future. Innovators, not traditionalists. This private performance had accomplished what no public debate or formal negotiation ever could. It bypassed politics and went straight to pragmatism. It demonstrated the power of shared creation in a way 1,000 reports could not. The betrothal to Prefect Jorak's son was a link to the old power structure. This was a bridge to the next one. In the quiet of her daughter's chamber, surrounded by the lingering echo of an impossible duet, matriarch Celine Argentis chose evolution. She secured their path forward not for love but for survival, and in doing so she gave them a weapon far stronger than defiance: legitimacy. The Grand Hall of the Harmony of Worlds event was a monument to diplomatic formality. Representatives from 12 star systems sat in silent rows, their attention focused on the central stage where the Vidian Compact awaited its final signing. The air hummed with the low thrum of translation devices and the unspoken tension of interstellar politics. This was meant to be a brief ceremonial prelude to the real business of treaties and trade agreements. Then the main doors opened. Linza and Cade entered. They were not in the simple garments of performers. They wore formal regalia provided by Celine, a shimmering Argentium weave gown for her, a tailored officer's tunic free of rank insignia for him. They carried their xenophones not as tools but as extensions of their intent. They walked to the center of the stage, their presence a stark, unexpected statement. Cade's note did not roar across the galaxy. It whispered, a quiet, sustained sound born from desperation in a dirty backstage. It traveled through networks and star systems not as a demand, but as an invitation. This whisper illustrates a fundamental law of connected worlds. A small action, barely audible at its origin, can generate immense impact as it echoes through complex, intertwined societies. It proves that power isn't always found in the loudest voice or the biggest weapon. Sometimes, the most transformative force is a single honest vibration that refuses to fade. The metaphor of the whisper defines how true ideas spread. They don't always arrive with fanfare or declaration. They move quietly, persistently from one mind to another, bypassing official channels and cultural filters. Cade's music became that whisper. It didn't shout arguments about equality or collaboration. It simply demonstrated them. It changed how species viewed each other not through debate, but through a shared, felt experience. A Krellian merchant felt a tremor of recognition. An Illuminati scholar heard a new harmonic possibility. The change was subtle, personal, and because of that, more permanent. This quiet insistence stands in stark contrast to the loud opposition it faced. The dismissive laughter of the crowd, the cold authority of the Vexillian Guard, the organized violence of Nevin's mercenaries. These were all loud forces. They were meant to intimidate, to control, to silence. But the whisper proved more powerful because it didn't fight their volume. It invited a different response. It asked the listener to lean in, to pay closer attention, to truly hear what was being offered. A shout can be dismissed. A whisper creates curiosity. Galactic history is rarely rewritten by grand pronouncements from podiums. Lasting change more often comes from these quiet demonstrations of what is possible. It comes from a proof of concept, a working model that makes old arguments seem suddenly obsolete. Cade's journey itself mirrors this principle. He began as a Marine, a man trained for the shout of battle and the roar of engines. He ended as a musician whose greatest weapon was a sustained, quiet note. His influence grew not when he was loudest, but when he was most authentically, vulnerably soft. The entire galaxy learned to listen more carefully because of that one note's echo. It taught them that the most important signals are not always the strongest ones. They are the ones that carry truth. In the constant noise of diplomacy, commerce, and conflict, a whisper of genuine human emotion cut through everything. It reminded every species that beneath the politics and the prejudice there is a common frequency, a shared capacity to feel, to hope, to connect. And sometimes all it takes is one person, willing to be quiet and honest, to make the entire universe lean in and finally hear it. The echo of that whisper is still traveling, still changing things, one listener at a time. Cade's story proves human emotion is a powerful weapon in any galaxy. His raw performance, driven by hunger, challenged a rigid society's core values. The question, "Can I play for food?" unlocked a transformation that began with survival and ended with revolution. It reminds us that profound change often starts with a basic human need. From desperation came connection, turning a plea for sustenance into a force that reshaped stars. Remember this. The most revolutionary acts can be born from the simplest truths, proving that even in darkness, a single honest note can light the way. Nevin Argentis stood with his brothers near the Argentian delegation. His posture was a rigid line of disapproval, his jaw tight. He represented the old guard, the unyielding belief in separation and purity. His scorn was a physical force in the room, a reminder of the centuries of tradition they were challenging. The audience, a sea of diverse species and diplomatic titles, watched in rapt silence. There were no murmurs, no shifting in seats. The gravity of the moment was understood by all. This was no longer a cultural presentation. It was a confrontation they began to play. The duet was not a display of technical virtuosity. It was a journey. Linz's notes built a structure of perfect crystalline harmony, the mathematical soul of Argentian music. Cade's playing was different. He answered her precision with raw emotion, weaving a thread of human experience through her flawless architecture. The music spoke of loss that transcended species, of a longing for connection that every being in the hall could recognize, of a hope that felt fragile and immense. It bypassed the intellect and spoke directly to the core of what it meant to feel isolated, to want to belong, to dream of something more. The performance demonstrated a simple, undeniable truth. Emotional authenticity could bridge the gap that technical perfection alone could never cross. A shared feeling, honestly expressed, was a language every species understood. Nevin's rigid stance began to change. The scorn in his eyes did not vanish, but it was joined by something else, a dawning, reluctant recognition. He saw not a violation of rules, but the creation of a new one. He saw the cultural power his house could wield by embracing this fusion, not fighting it. The calculation in his gaze shifted from opposition to assessment. This shift happened in real time across the hall. Diplomats who had arrived to argue over tariffs and security clauses found themselves disarmed. The carefully prepared arguments for maintaining strict species-specific cultural policies suddenly felt hollow, outdated. The music was rewriting the compact's cultural calculus as they listened. It was proving that collaboration was not a weakness but a source of unparalleled strength. The potential for shared innovation became more compelling than the fear of dilution. When the final note faded, the silence was absolute. Then not applause but a wave of murmured conversation swept through the delegates. They were not discussing border disputes or resource allocations. They were talking about the music. They were asking how such a collaboration was possible. They were debating the artistic and social implications of what they had just witnessed. A Krellian admiral was overheard asking an Illuminati curator about joint conservatory programs. A Vexillian trade minister inquired about cultural exchange initiatives. The single performance had achieved a quiet, profound reconciliation that years of closed-door negotiations had failed to produce. It had not just entertained them. It had changed their definition of what was possible. Selena Argentis moved through the diplomatic reception that followed, her posture radiating a new kind of authority. The performance had resolved a complex equation in her mind. She approached other House matriarchs and compact delegates not with apologies, but with a recalibrated strategy. Her argument was pragmatic, stripped of sentiment. She spoke of adaptive advantage, of cultural leverage, of positioning their house as architects of the new galactic paradigm, not custodians of the old. The galaxy is changing, she stated, her voice carrying through the murmuring crowd. Species that can't adapt will be left behind. It was a statement of fact, not philosophy. The formal dissolution of Linza's betrothal to Prefect Jorak's son was announced not as a scandal, but as a strategic reallocation of assets. The council, witnessing the performance's profound effect on the delegates, expressed a new willingness to adapt traditions that no longer served a practical purpose. The ripple effect was immediate and tangible. Cross-species collaboration shed its status as a cultural taboo and was reassessed as a strategic diplomatic asset. Trade consortiums that had previously insisted on species-specific partnerships began drafting proposals for mixed-species research and development teams. The Vidian Compact's cultural annex, once a dry document outlining respectful non-interference, was quietly rewritten to include clauses encouraging artistic and scientific co-creation. The success of the duet provided a blueprint, a proven model that pragmatists could point to. It was no longer about emotion. It was about results. In a quiet anteroom away from the calculating eyes of the delegates, Cade and Linza finally found a moment alone. Their relationship had shed its earlier tension, evolving from a guarded romance into a shared, tangible mission. The victory was not just personal, it was a proof of concept they now felt responsible for advancing. Their kiss was not just an expression of affection, it was a seal on a partnership that had already altered the political landscape of three systems. Their quiet vows to each other were intertwined with a commitment to this new cultural frontier. Their personal happiness and their public purpose had become inseparable. The initial victory of cultural integration through their art began to mutate, generating broader and more profound consequences. It wasn't just about music anymore. Aristocratic houses that had once been their most vocal opponents now sent discreet inquiries to Theron's studio, seeking introductions to human artists and musicians. They weren't interested in sentiment. They saw the political and economic advantage in being associated with this new wave of innovation. The cultural landscape of the galaxy was shifting at a pace its formal political systems could not hope to match. Treaties and councils were always playing catch-up to the realities on the ground. This rapid recalibration demonstrated a fundamental truth that diplomats often forget. Art doesn't wait for permission. It creates new facts. It opens doors in the cultural consciousness that politics then has to walk through. A single desperate performance had accomplished what years of careful negotiation could not. It made the idea of collaboration feel not just possible, but inevitable. It proved that when diplomacy stagnates in closed rooms, art can kick the doors down and show everyone what's already happening outside. The rules were being rewritten not in legislative chambers but in studios, in streets and in the shared spaces between species. The new architecture of galactic society was being composed one unexpected duet at a time. It started with a question born from the most basic human need. "Can I play for food?" Cade's voice was raw, stripped of pride. A simple plea for survival in a city that saw him as worthless. That question, spoken to the galaxy's most celebrated musician, was the spark. It was not a request for charity. It was an offer of trade. The only currency he had left was the feeling he could force through an alien instrument. In that moment, he was not a hero or a revolutionary. He was a starving man. But that simple, desperate question became the key that unlocked a galaxy. The food he sought was temporary nourishment. The music he offered in return became something far more sustaining. It fed a hunger the galaxy didn't know it had, a craving for authentic connection, for truth that wasn't polished or perfected. His initial desperation, the sheer need to quiet the ache in his stomach, yielded to a purpose he never imagined. His personal survival became secondary to a larger idea. He became a living argument against a system built on separation, proving that human emotional depth could find cracks in the most rigid structures and widen them into doorways. This entire arc embodies a core truth of science fiction. It's not the advanced technology or the political power that truly changes things. It's the raw, unvarnished human experience. It's the willingness to be vulnerable, to show your pain and your hope without filter. Cade's broken note, full of fractures and feeling, did what 1,000 flawless performances could not. It reached across biological divides and resonated with a universal longing. It proved that genuine expression is a force that can dismantle entrenched prejudice and fear. The closing mood is not one of triumphant conquest, but of hard-won resilience. It's the quiet hum of two different worlds learning to resonate together, finding a shared frequency through the medium of art. The fear of change, the terror of dilution that drove the aristocracy to send mercenaries, was outweighed by the undeniable power of what they created together. The question was answered not with a loaf of bread, but with a new future. It proved that art's ability to build bridges is stronger than any institution's desire to build walls. Their commitment to a shared life is the final, powerful statement. It represents a galaxy slowly opening itself to the idea that diverse voices, when allowed to harmonize, create a richer, stronger whole. Cade the Marine and Linza the Aristocrat are more than a couple. They are a symbol. They are the living proof that the most revolutionary acts can begin with the simplest, most human questions. A plea for food became a symphony of freedom, and a galaxy leaned in to listen. The echoes of that one note are still traveling, rewriting the rules of what is possible. Cade's journey demonstrates that the galaxy's most advanced suppression systems had no defense against a simple, human truth. Alien societies built on technology and political control found their structures crumbling when faced with something they had dismissed as primitive: raw, unfiltered emotion. Where fleets and diplomatic maneuvering had failed for decades, one man's unpolished expression of pain succeeded. The very quality these cultures had tried to filter out became the key that unlocked their walls. His Marine training provided the discipline to stand before a crowd of mocking aliens, but it was his humanity that forged the real weapon. The military taught him how to endure, how to follow orders, how to survive. It did not teach him how to feel. That was entirely his own. This core premise lies at the heart of countless tales where human qualities defy a technologically superior setting. Our strength isn't just in our tools or our tactics. It's in the messy, unpredictable depth of our emotional experience, something more calculated species often overlook. The establishment attempted to silence what it couldn't categorize. They prized technical perfection, a clean, measurable standard that reinforced their sense of order. Cade's broken note, full of fractures and honest feeling, was a direct assault on that value system. It echoed through their halls not because it was perfect, but because it was true. It carried the weight of loneliness and hunger, sensations every being understands on some level, regardless of biology. That authenticity bypassed their cultural filters and struck directly at a shared, universal core. This single, vulnerable act became the catalyst for a shift across 3 star systems. It proved that in a universe of hardened carapaces and polished silver skin, human fragility could be a source of unbelievable strength. Vulnerability invites connection, where armor only promotes distance. Cade's willingness to stand there, stripped of pride, and channel his pain through an alien instrument demonstrated a courage different from the battlefield kind. It was the courage to be seen, truly seen, at your most broken. Their eventual collaboration sealed the argument. Linza's technical mastery provided the structure, the accepted language of their world. Cade's emotional depth provided the soul, the human element that gave the mathematics meaning. Together, they created a revolution. They proved that the combination of discipline and feeling is unstoppable. The weapon that changed the galaxy wasn't housed in a warship's bay or a mercenary's grip. It was in the calloused hands of a starving Marine who chose to express his pain instead of hiding it. He didn't fire a shot. He played a note. And that note, imperfect and raw, did what an armada could not. It reminded a galaxy how to feel, and in feeling, how to change. Cade and Linsa stood together after the performance, their hands not quite touching in the formal hall, but their connection was a physical thing in the space between them. Their partnership had built more than a romantic bond. It had constructed infrastructure. The duet they created was not just a piece of music. It was a blueprint. It provided a working model, a set of instructions for how two different species could combine their strengths to create something neither could achieve alone. Other artists watched the recordings, heard the fusion of precise Argentian harmonics with raw human emotion, and saw a path forward. The template existed now. It could be followed. This musical bridge they built began to support connections far beyond the stage. Diplomats and trade officials who had been at an impasse for cycles found that discussing the artistic collaboration opened doors. It created a shared language of possibility, where formal negotiations had only produced stalemates. The art created a pathway where politics had encountered only solid walls. A Krellian merchant might not understand human social customs, but he could understand the power of a melody that made his carapace vibrate with an unfamiliar feeling. An Illuminari curator could debate the technical merits of the fusion for hours. The music gave them a neutral, productive ground to meet on. Their success sent a signal across the communications networks. It inspired a wave of attempts. A Vexillian percussionist reached out to a human digital composer. An Argentian lattice weaver began collaborating with a Saurian holographer. These were small acts, but they were significant. They represented a cultural shift away from isolation and toward exchange. The centuries of ingrained prejudice, the quiet separation enforced by tradition, began to dissolve under the pressure of shared creation. People were curious. They wanted to try it for themselves. This new bridge proved more durable than any political agreement signed on a data slate. Treaties could be renegotiated or broken. Alliances could shift with the political winds. But a piece of co-created art, a song or a sculpture or a story, existed as a permanent fact. It was proof that collaboration had worked, that it could produce a tangible result. It was harder to argue against something you could hear and feel. Their example demonstrated that working together could achieve outcomes that competition and isolation never could. A single voice was a note. Many voices in harmony were a force. The galaxy slowly began to understand a new principle. Diversity in creation was not a weakness to be managed. It was a strength to be harnessed. Different perspectives, different biologies, different ways of processing the universe. When combined, they produced stronger, more innovative, more resilient cultural outcomes. The music was richer. The art was more interesting. The ideas were better. This became Cade and Linsa's most lasting legacy, far beyond their single performance or the immediate political changes it spurred. They did not just play a song. They built the first span of a bridge, and then they watched as others began to build their own, connecting worlds that had been separate for far too long. The structure grew, strong and silent, made of sound and shared purpose. Cade's path from Marine to station vagrant to cultural revolutionary defied conventional logic. His transition was not a clean promotion or a simple shift in career. It was a raw, messy evolution forced by circumstance. The discipline of his military service remained, a hard kernel of internal order. But the content of his life, the purpose that drove him, had to be entirely rebuilt from the wreckage of his post-war reality. He learned to channel a soldier's focus into an artist's expression. The transformation illustrates a brutal but vital truth. Skills forged in one crucible can find unexpected application in another. The mind that once calculated artillery trajectories learned to map harmonic progressions. His ability to adapt marine strategic thinking to a cultural campaign proved decisive. Assessing threats, identifying vulnerabilities, planning in advance, these were not just combat skills. They were frameworks for understanding any complex system. In the Undersighty, he didn't fight with a rifle. He navigated by reading the environment like a battlefield, interpreting the rumble of machinery as intelligence on guard patrols, using pressure changes in pipes to sense movement. His planning sessions with Linza and Theron were tactical briefings. The target was no longer a hilltop, but the consciousness of an entire galactic audience. The Marine who once fought with projectile weapons now fought with resonance and emotional truth. This unexpected application of military training demonstrates its profound value beyond the battlefield. The structure, the resilience, the strategic mindset, these are not limited to warfare. They are tools for problem-solving in any hostile environment, whether it's a combat zone or a politically charged galactic salon. Cade's journey mirrors the difficult transition many veterans face, the struggle to find a new identity and purpose once the uniform is gone. The loss of that clear, defined role can feel like a second amputation. His initial desperation, the hollow hunger in the streets of Cerulean Port, reflects a deep search for meaning after the mission ends. His ultimate success offers a powerful model. It shows how military discipline, when combined with civilian creativity and passion, can become a source of incredible innovation. It's the fusion of structure and soul. The galaxy did not just gain a musician. It gained a strategist who understood conflict from the ground level, who could see the psychological terrain as clearly as the physical. He brought a soldier's understanding of pressure and breaking points to a cultural struggle. His transformation from a broken man begging for scraps to a key architect of interstellar change is the story's final, quiet argument. Our lowest points, the moments of greatest shame and vulnerability, often contain the seeds of our greatest strength. The pain he carried was not a weakness to be hidden. It was the fuel for the fire that warmed a cold galaxy. He did not leave the Marine behind. He simply gave him a new instrument and a much larger battlefield. They met in the quiet moments, in the gaps between Linza's scheduled obligations, in the shadowed alcoves of the compound's gardens where the surveillance fields grew weak. The air between them was thick with the unspoken weight of her family's expectations. Cade saw the tension in her hands, the way she held herself as if waiting for a command. They weren't just two people. They were a problem that needed a solution. The pressure was a physical force, and they bent under it, forging a plan not from hope but from necessity. The opportunity was the Vidian Compact's cultural presentation. It was a formality, a brief interlude of artistic display before the signing of the monumental trade and defense agreement. Aristocrats and diplomats from 3 systems would be present, their attention a precious commodity. It was the brightest stage imaginable. Their plan was to seize it. They would not perform separate pieces. They would create one, a duet. Linza would provide the complex, mathematically perfect harmonic structures of Argentian composition. Cade would layer it with the raw, emotive resonance only a human could produce. It was a fusion that had no precedent. They took the idea to Theron in his studio, the air still humming with the memory of Cade's first performance. The Illuminari listened, his large eyes flicking between their determined faces. He understood music. He also understood politics. "That's ambitious," he said, his voice low. A pause hung in the air, heavy with implication. "It's dangerous." He didn't list the reasons. They all knew them. But then he gestured to the xenophones resting on their stands. "The acoustics here are neutral. The door locks from the inside. You can work here." His studio became more than a practice space. It became a sanctuary, a war room. Their goal shifted then. It was no longer just about being together, or even about proving their individual worth. It became a campaign. They were aiming to demonstrate that the collaboration of different species could create something neither could achieve alone, something transformative. They were attacking the very foundation of the sectarian rules that governed their lives, the idea that purity, in bloodline or culture, was the highest virtue. The risk was absolute. Failure meant more than personal heartbreak. It meant disgrace for Linza, exile for Cade, and professional ruin for Theron. It could be seen as a direct insult to the Compact delegates, a sabotage of interstellar diplomacy. But the potential reward was a new paradigm. A galaxy where collaboration wasn't just tolerated but valued, where the barriers between species could be bridged by shared creation instead of fortified by ancient prejudice. This possibility fueled them through the long hours in Theron's studio. They treated their composition like a battle plan, mapping harmonic progressions and emotional crescendos with the same intensity Cade had once used to plot troop movements. They were building a weapon made of sound, and they intended to fire it at the heart of the establishment. Every note was a calculated risk, every rest a held breath. They were betting everything on the hope that their combined truth was more powerful than centuries of tradition. The studio walls absorbed their fear and their focus, containing the quiet revolution they were composing, one dangerous, beautiful note at a time. Nevin Argentis made a single call from the silent privacy of his quarters. His instructions were concise, stripped of emotion. An hour later, a 3-person mercenary team moved through the port's commercial district with a chilling lack of urgency. They didn't look like soldiers. They looked like dock workers or low-level techs finishing a shift. One was a Saurian, his scales scarred from old conflicts, his eyes flat and assessing. They waited for the moment Cade was alone, walking the short, unguarded route between Theron's studio and a public transit hub. The abduction was fluid and silent. An aircar slid to the curb. A door opened. A pressurized injector hissed against Cade's neck. His world dissolved into chemical static before he could even register a threat. There was no struggle, no shouted alarm. To any bystander, it looked like a friend helping a sick companion into a vehicle. The aircar merged back into traffic, its operation a model of brutal efficiency. It was a transaction clean and professional. It showed how easily order could be enforced by those with the credits to buy silence. Cade woke in a holding cell that smelled of ozone and stale air. His hands were bound with military-grade energy cuffs. A comm unit on the wall flickered to life. The face that appeared wasn't one of his captors. It was Nevin. The offer was delivered with the cold precision of a business arrangement. Cade's continued existence, his safety, was conditional. The terms were unambiguous. If he attempted escape, if he contacted Linsa, if he showed his face at the Vidian Compact ceremony, the consequences would fall upon her. Her standing, her future, her safety, all were instruments of his control. His freedom was traded for her protection. The choice was a form of sacrifice he understood better than music. Surrender yourself to protect your comrades. This small, secure cell was a revelation. It was a piece of infrastructure, a hidden node in a network that serviced the needs of the powerful. The mercenaries who guarded him weren't thugs. They were professionals operating a service. They spoke in clipped technical terms about transfer schedules and containment protocols. It exposed the entire underscape that thrived beneath the polished surfaces of Cerulean Port. The smuggling, the discreet abductions, the betrayals available for a price. The Argentian family's perfect image was maintained by this kind of ruthless, unseen labor. Tradition wasn't just about bloodlines and silver halls. It was enforced with clinical violence. Cade's marine mind, fogged by drugs and disorientation, began to clear. He stopped thinking like a prisoner and started thinking like a strategist. He studied the cell door's locking mechanism, the guard rotation patterns he could hear through the vents, the type of cuffs on his wrists. This wasn't a fight he could win with his fists. It required a different kind of combat. He understood then that the fight was no longer about his life or even Linza's. It was about the idea they represented, the principle that two people from different worlds could create something new. His capture proved how fragile that idea was, how fiercely the old order would fight to stop it. The organized, cold-blooded opposition they faced made their musical dream feel terrifyingly vulnerable. One wrong move and it would all shatter. The guard watching Cade's cell was a Gellan, his tough hide marked with service stripes from some forgotten security force. He didn't speak for the first hour of his shift, just watched with solid black eyes. Then almost to himself he began to hum. The melody was rough, unformed but recognizable. It was the lingering note from Cade's viral performance. The sound echoed softly in the metal cell. Cade looked up. The guard's gaze held his for a long moment. The High-Bloods wouldn't like that. The Gellan rumbled, his voice a low vibration. It wasn't a warning. It was a confession. He tapped a code into the door console. The energy cuffs on Cade's wrists dissolved into mist. Maintenance conduit. 3 levels down. Follow the yellow markings. He didn't offer a reason. He didn't need to. The hummed melody was reason enough. The conduit was a narrow tube smelling of recycled water and chemical cleaners. It was the port's vascular system, carrying waste and runoff from the gleaming upper levels down to the processing plants far below. Cade moved through the cramped darkness, his shoulders scraping against the smooth sides. The yellow markers glowed at intervals, a faint beacon in the gloom. This was not a place of polished silver and respectful silence. This was a world of function, of hidden mechanics, of things the aristocracy preferred not to see. The air grew thicker, warmer. The distant rumble of machinery was a constant companion.